Hello, fitness business nerds. What's up? Welcome to another episode of the Business for Unicorns podcast. And today, I think for the first time in 2023, I got Fisher and Pete with me. What's up, gents?
Hello, gentlemen. Good to be back.
Hello.
Happy New Year. Even though I think this will be released later in January, I'm still going to say Happy New Year. It's good to have you back on the podcast, friends, after a quick little holiday break. And we're diving right in with a conversation today about marketing. And I think, Fisher, you said this is a question. I don't remember where this one came from. Was this the one that you put on here?
Yes, this one came from my heart.
This one came from Mark's heart. So today's topic, straight from Mark's heart organ. And
Yes.
the topic is this, and I'll frame it up, and then Fisher, if you want to give it more color, you can. But the topic is, oftentimes we talk to people and they have this sense in marketing that they have to choose between the kind of tacky, high pressure sales kind of marketing that maybe is borderline unethical, but maybe very effective. And on the other end of the spectrum, a kind of very genuine, very authentic, maybe soft sell kind of approach, which is maybe a little less effective, but feels better. And we talk to people often who feel pulled between these two kind of created worlds. And today we want to talk a little bit about how do you find the balance between the two, if that's the goal, right? But what's the best way to balance this, possibly kind of tacky, slightly offensive, off-putting, borderline unethical marketing with what, on the other hand, is maybe too soft, not effective enough, but feels really good and genuine kind of marketing, and is there somewhere in the middle? Is that, did I tee it up enough? What would you add, Fisher?
I think so. I think you have really teed it up. And I think the one thing we were mentioning before this podcast that I think we will acknowledge is not perfect about this framing is we're not suggesting that there's a strict inverse correlation. So we're not suggesting that, for instance, the more unethical you are, the more money you make. And the more good person you are, the more likely you are to lose your house. So it's not inversely correlated, but it is true. You do have a lot of gray area where things can feel maybe not organic to a gym owner. They will be reticent to maybe use a certain technique, a certain phrasing, a certain bit of copy, etc. And it is challenging, frankly, on the outside without knowing more about your business, whether in fact that is your internal integrity, ethical barometer saying this is actually too far and I'm not comfortable with this because this is either too far from the truth and or I actually do think this is potentially going to do damage to someone or if the issue is just that owner is, as Keeler said, so far on your back of heels that any taking an assertive stand for what an individual in front of you might need feels overstepping and inappropriate.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll say this, that I don't want to present the same way that you said, is that it's not either or. We're not suggesting that these two approaches are actually real and
in fact, we want you to do high integrity marketing that does work. So we want you to do both.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. I think it's a false choice is I think the place I want to start here is that the first thing I want to say is that I think it's a false choice. And I think there are people at both ends of this spectrum that are doing good work. And there's people at both ends of the spectrum that are not. And by good work, I mean getting results, right? I know people, I think we all know fit pros who think it's unethical to use the word fat in their marketing. We all know fit pros who think it's unethical to use progress photos, right? And I think those are both examples of things that are, I think reasonable people can debate.
Yes.
And I think, and I think you can find success on either side of those fences that is both ethically grounded, moral, and drives leads. Yeah. So maybe I'll open up to two of you as individual entrepreneurs and business owners. Like, how do you think about balancing kind of this marketing spectrum? How do you find your sweet spot for where your boundaries are? I'll start with you, Fisher.
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts on that. So I guess I'll share some and then I'll pull up because I have a whole list of things I could share on this. I think the first thing, starting with where the real estate is cheap, where I think we can all agree on that I would say is wrong, is lying. So for me, I don't like lying. Like there's a difference between hyperbole and flat out lying. So our pal Lou Schuler, who many of you might know from his Men's Health days and writing Alan Cosgrove's books with him, wrote an article once I saw that was so thoughtful where basically the gist of the article was you have to use hyperbole, don't lie, but you have to use hyperbole, right? So if you're not using some hyperbole, if you're not selling what you're doing as great and amazing, then no one's really going to buy it, because at this point, that's what's required, right? Now, on the other side of that, you can push it so far that it is lying. And the two places where two examples of this, where I see this done, where I'm like, well, now you're lying, is when there is false urgency or scarcity. When you say you're only going to sell so many in a given period, or there's a certain deadline, and then oftentimes the gym owner, and by the way, they won't notice that this is out of integrity. I would make the case that it is. They attempt to manufacture a deadline, which is appropriate, right? Give people an urgent reason to take action, because if you can buy whenever, you will tend to buy never. But then somebody emails them 2 days after the sale, and then the owner honors whatever the thing was, thinking it's customer servicey. But I would maintain, well, now you're kind of out of integrity, because you told everyone else you weren't going to honor, and you did anyway. And again, I think, I would say that perhaps that particular version, as Keter said, is one where reasonable people could disagree. I'm not saying it's the worst sin in the world to do that, but I would say that, for instance, if you have an irresistible offer in your sales conversations, so something we teach at Business for Unicorns, and then we use at MFF, is we think it's valuable to create some time-sensitive value add that you only get if you sign up within 24 hours of the call. So it's not high pressure. You don't have to do it right this second. But if you don't sign up by perhaps the end of the day, you're not going to get the thing. Well, if you honor that afterwards, in my experience, the magic goes away, and it no longer works because the prospect knows you're lying. One other example of this is when people use the same email copy that describes a very specific kind of event during a launch, and they do multiple launches, and they just use the same exact thing. Well, it's this specific scenario, this hyper specific detailed story about what's going on in your business as you desperately try to handle all the sales coming in, is not true both times word for word. So this would be not accurate. That would be what I would say lying. And again, are these the worst ethical lapse in the world? No. Or, are these people like bad humans? I don't think so. But I think a specific example of doing this that I would say is too far is anytime you are lying to create scarcity and urgency. So I'll pull up there, but that's my first of many thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's a really good one. It's like lying, I think, is a boundary most of us can get behind, right? It's like, that's just not okay. We learned that when we were little tiny people. But I also say I think maybe give a few examples of good hyperbole. The thing that pops into my mind is like, at MFF, we often talk of ourselves as being like the friendliest gym in New York City, right? Or in some cases, I know I've referred to MFF as like the gayest gym in New York City, right? Which on some level is hyperbole. I might make a case that some of that's factually
I think that's
true.
That could be hard to argue that.
Right. But there's examples of ways you talk about your business. It's like, we are like the best trained trainers on the planet, right? Are these examples of hyperbole that shows that we believe in ourselves that I wouldn't classify as lying.
Yes.
Right? There's like
show me your evidence. Show me your evidence. How can you say
sense
that?
of like a puffed up confidence that I think is actually really useful.
Yeah. And of course, that kind of puffed up too, I think does potentially lend itself to a certain type of aware consumer who's been burnt before, that if you push it too far, you do turn people off, because if you're being that hyperbolic, well, how can I trust anything? This is objectively not true.
Yeah.
If I can, I know you have another thought there, Keter, but one thing I forgot to mention, I think is a good way of doing this also is, again, I think you can manufacture urgency and scarcity by creating it. You just have to honor it. So another example would be most facilities can only sell so many trials in a given week or in a given month, or your services would fall apart. So I don't think there's anything wrong with articulating how many you can sell, because that is factually true. Now, whether you will get there or not, maybe that's not likely, but it's not wrong to let people know there are, in fact, a limited quantity, because in fact, practice, that is true, right? And we have had moments in MFF's history, again, we're a little bit unusual, so usually we're not a good person to compare to, where when we were coming back from COVID, we would have to waitlist trials for sometimes a couple weeks at a time, because HomeBody had scaled up so quickly, we just actually couldn't do strategy sessions. We couldn't onboard people. We were flooding our classes. Now, that's an unusual situation, and I pray you have that issue. But regardless, you still have a number of leads that your facility can handle in a given week or month before your services and fulfillments do fall apart.
For sure. Yeah, great example. Yeah, what about you, Pete? How do you think about boundaries for yourself in terms of the messaging and content you're putting out there?
Well, when we floated this concept in my head, I wasn't really thinking about such extremes like, are you comfortable with lying, or are you going to be like by the book here? I mean, sure, I'm I have had one of my biggest pet peeves within this industry since the start of my time in the industry was the online service provider who said, "Great news, I've decided to open up a slot in my program."
Yes.
And I'm like, bullshit, you did. And honestly, my business partner, Eric, wrote what was probably 1,000 to 1,500 word diatribe on this in our internal intern community, basically saying, stop it to all the people who have ever done that. And it was wonderful because I stopped seeing it internally at that point. But beyond that, to me, this is a question of basically, if it's out of character for you to be super salesy in nature, are you comfortable with stepping outside your comfort zone and writing some catchy copy, but it doesn't feel authentic to you? And we don't do a ton of selling here, which is why, one, I wasn't the first person to talk out of the gate here. And by selling, I mean marketing of this nature, but I do a little of it. For example, we're opening up our summer collegiate development program now. It's a really high ticket item. It's, it's $3,500 to get your foot through the door for 10 weeks to train with us. It's bundled everything we do. It's a lot of cash flow for us every June to early August, and we need to sell the shit out of it. But between you and me, we will say we have a cap of a number of bodies, but at that price point, if I tell you it's a head count of 50 and 55 people show up saying, I have $3,500 to give you, those extra 5 people just created $15,000 worth of cash flow for me that I can use to acquire the coaches that I need to expand my capacity. So I don't necessarily have this internal conflict in place when if I say we have room for this and then we go higher, because one, I have basically unlimited space. I've got a 15,000 square foot facility. It's got a huge capacity. So in this case, what I'm promising people is a favorable client to coach ratio and a certain degree of attention to detail that I will guarantee with a group of 5, 10, 15, or 55, because the cash flow is there to staff up in a way that makes sure that people feel like I way over delivered on touch points. So that's a little bit of a slippery slope.
And I think that's so true, right? Because you're not saying like, I guarantee there's only 50 spots. Absolutely. There's no scenario in which. What you're not saying is we only have, 50 spots available or whatever.
For existing staff.
But we also just want to say that, of course, if we get more of you, we will hire more staff. I just want to be transparent about that. That there's no reason to add that extra thing,
Exactly. Our system as currently constituted can accommodate 50. Now, if I were to be blessed with the privilege, I know. And we talked about this on a recent podcast where I said, hey, have we ever asked ourselves the question, what happens if we crush it? This is what I'm talking about. Who is the third pitching coach in our space if we are in excess of 50 opportunities? And we have put thought into that, and we do know who the calls will be. So that's one thought there. The other thing is, as it relates to social media, as it relates to marketing and all of these things, I think the person who is writing the copy and deciding to do the marketing is more insecure or assumes their audience to be evaluating them more thoroughly than they actually are. And sometimes you just got to experiment. And if you feel you put out something that's a little more salesy in nature than you're comfortable with, it might be hard for you and you feel like, I've really compromised on who I am and what my identity is within this space. And you know what? Nobody cares. Nobody is sitting at home being like, gosh, this is out of character for Mark. I'm so pissed. They just scroll to the next thing. So I guess I'd say, you know what? Get over it. Try something new. You want to drive some new business? Drive some new business by reading a bunch of Mark's email copy and try and emulate Mark, even if it feels a little out of character, because you don't know what works until you try it. And then lastly, if you go so far outside of your comfort zone with these things, you're going to attract leads that don't really align with the client avatar as it is. So it's very short-term thinking in my mind, and you're going to attract people that weren't a perfect fit in the first place, and that's going to hurt retention numbers. You're going to realize, I'm capable of driving leads, but are they quality leads? And so don't go so far off the deep end with it that it's completely out of line with how you have driven awareness toward your business in the past, because you're going to need to overhaul the entire culture and community if you do it. So it's a double-edged sword in that sense.
I think that's such a great point, Pete. I think, I think the North Star for most people listening should be that the experience that you're offering out there in marketing land, through your emails, your social media, whatever ways you're marketing, should mimic the kind of vibe and experience they get when they actually come to work with y'all. right? The way you talk about your value proposition, the way you talk about your culture, your community, your services, your training, your nutrition, all the ways you talk about the stuff should be mimicked. And the marketing might be a heightened version of it. It might be a more persuasive version of it, but it should have the same flavor as the experience they get once they walk through the doors. And if there's a disconnect there, I think that's a problem. And it's not a problem for ethical reasons. It's a problem for retention reasons, that what you sold me and the vibe that I got on your social media is just so different than what happened when I walked through the door. It gives the people that smell of distrust, that smell of something fishy is going on here. And that's a problem in any business. Yeah.
Yep.
I think the one thing I want to double down on that you said, Pete, that I think is most in line with the kind of people we talk to. So the kind of folks that join Unicorn Society are almost never the kind of folks that are drawn to those somewhat sketchy, shady strategies. Right? Almost no Unicorn Society member I've ever met has ever been like, oh, should I try that really shady thing that lies to people? No one ever says that. If anything, we attract people who are on the far other end of the spectrum, is that they're not aggressive enough. They're not, to your point, Pete, experimenting enough outside their comfort zone. And so I think, most listeners, if you like us and have been listening to this podcast for a while, you're probably in that category. And like, I think, I want to double down what Pete says. Your job is to stretch yourself. How much more confident can you sound? How much persuasive can you try to be? How many more sales tips and tricks and tactics can you employ and still feel like yourself, right? And expand that version of your voice? Because that's the thing I think people get scared to do. Anything that smells salesy, they just recoil from. And here's the thing, is like our business requires us to get good at sales. You have to find the version of your voice that is authentic and effective at that space. And for most of our listeners, you're going to have to actually push yourself to actually get more tactical and more persuasive. Yeah, I see you guys shaking your head, so I'm guessing you agree with that.
Yeah, the people who have that inclination, this feels too salesy, have probably used their platform to do what Gary Vee would call jabbing relentlessly, and they never right hook. So it's just jab, 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 and then declare to the world, I'm not comfortable with selling. That's not who we are. Yeah. We're too authentic for that. And then if the right hook never comes, sure, no one's going to be offended on the other end, but you're also not going to be saving toward retirement, I don't think. So
you're not going to be
occasionally you got to take a swing.
Yeah, that's it. Fisher, I think you had another thought you want to circle back to.
Oh boy, yeah, I'm trying to decide.
This could be a 9-hour podcast.
So many thoughts. I mean, I think it's such a great distinction too about the difference between unethical versus just inauthentic, right? Where it's like, this isn't unethical, just like not who I am. And, I think that's such an art, right? I've often thought about and written about authenticity being a almost unhelpful and not useful thing, because humans are just so varied and we grow and we change and we're different situations. But there is something to be said for, who does your business need you to be? And how do you become that person, right? And it's an art. And maybe some people say, like, I just can't be that person that the business needs. I just have more rigidity in the nature of who I am, right? And of course, there's a lot of debate about that, right? Like, do people change? And of course, people very strong opinions one or the other. And it's probably some of both. There are probably some people that just can't actually seem to change that much, whether by genetics or by their mindsets. And some people do seem to have lots of opportunity. But I think there's a nugget in there in that, who do you need to be as the chief salesperson, marketer of your business? Because that's your job if you're the gym owner. And how do you do it in a way that feels authentic to you? Because you do have an advantage if you are me, right? So I am crazy. So it's easy for me to really push the limits of the salesiness because it's authentic to who I am. Now, I would also note, I very much consider myself in the sales marketing paradigm of hunters and farmers. I'm very much a farmer. So I will hunt as best I can from behind my keyboard. But if I'm in a one-on-one sales conversation, I'm not a high pressure. Like, I'm not that guy. I'm never going to do that. And I think there's maybe something in there too for listeners for you to consider. Are you more of a hunter? Are you more of a farmer? It is probably true that the better you get with written sales and the better you get in marketing in general, the more you fertilize the conversations you have, the less you have to pull out anything remotely high pressure-y. Though, again, I don't think it needs to be high pressure-y in the sales conversation necessarily for you to be successful. But I think Keeler and Pete's point is so well taken. If you're listening to this podcast, it is likely you are not the kind of person that we have to pull back on. It's likely you need to in most cases, probably need to course correct and be willing to be a little bit more assertive that feels natural. I think if I can just make one other final point that is part of this conversation is when we're thinking about even things like website design, right? One thing that is an interesting paradigm, and I think most of the world has landed, I think correctly on StoryBrand seems to be the best way to do it. But for a long time, there was a lot of debate in website creation because you had the artistic preferences of a web developer that wanted to impress their parents with a beautiful piece of art that doesn't understand business and doesn't make any money. Or you had on the other side these very hilarious long form direct mail, yellow highlight as if you're going to clip the coupon out of the thing because it's been split tested billions of times. That is tacky as all hell to look at, but by all accounts, when tested amongst a large enough traffic base, tends to make more money than something that's a little bit softer side of Sears. And that is attention, right? That is one of those places. And again, I don't think it's inversely correlated. I think the better providers of gym websites at this point will give you the benefit of something that actually looks good, that's not embarrassing for your family to see, but also meaningfully converts. Because if you had to choose one or the other, again, ideally you're not choosing both, but I don't know if I had to, I'm probably going with a boring website that converts, right? Which is like, I'm the unicorn guy. There was a chat today in the Facebook group, one of our beloved members was musing out loud a way I really appreciated. And they were essentially, the question was something that just I just had my new website. I feel like it might be a little cookie cutter, but I'm pretty sure it converts because I'm working with Kilo, which is the company we recommend people to. So, and I'm asking myself, I don't know, is that fine? Who cares if it just needs to get leads in the door? And I was like, yes, yes. Save your art for your weekends. Use your website to make money and help people change their lives. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think this pairs really well with a conversation about like form over function, and that can be another version of this conversation. But I think let's leave it there because I think we could keep talking about this for a long time. But I think that where we're coming out on this, it seems like if I had to summarize for our dear listeners, which is really think about where your boundaries are in terms of the voice you want to put out into the world. And if you're listening to this podcast, it seems like we all agree you're probably someone who needs to push yourself a little bit harder, a little bit further to actually learn to embrace marketing and sales tactics that are effective and expand your voice to learn new skills and new techniques that maybe are a little more persuasive, a little more confident. And I think, the question you posed, Fisher, I think is a great one is who do you need to become to be the marketer and the voice of your business that actually attracts the leads that keeps your doors open? Right. And I think that's a great question to leave you with as we, enter into this new year. Well, thanks for the great conversation, gents. This was a good one, maybe a little philosophical, but I think we got to some takeaways that I think are pretty useful and grounded. So let's leave it there. Listeners, if you love this podcast, please leave us a review anywhere you listen to this podcast. I think this one gets at least 5 stars. And let us know what you want us to talk about next. Email us, Michael, Pete, Mark at businessforunicorns.com. And gents, I'll see you on the next one.
Take care, guys.
Bye-bye. It's Mark. I hope you loved today's show. Now, as you may know, due to overwhelming demand, our coaching group exclusively for brick and mortar training gym owners, the Unicorn Society, is sold out. Alas. However, we do plan to open up a handful of spots later this year. So here's what to do. If you're interested to learn more about the program, see if you qualify, and importantly, get on the list for priority consideration for future spots, head to businessunicorns.com/unicorn. One more time, that's businessunicorns.com/unicorn. See you next time.